For most people, The Simpsons has always been just an animated sitcom, the longest-running series in American television history, built on sharp humor and familiar satire. It was never meant to be taken seriously. It was simply a mirror held up to everyday life, exaggerated and painted bright yellow. But over the years, something unusual began to emerge. Storylines that once felt like harmless jokes started lining up with real-world events. Political upsets, scientific discoveries, global scandals, even high-profile technology failures appeared years after the show had already played them for laughs. News outlets began pointing out the pattern, and audiences could no longer ignore how often fiction seemed to echo reality. Now media analysts reviewing old episodes are seeing a new wave of unsettling parallels. Scenes buried in seasons from decades ago are beginning to match the tensions, conflicts, and warnings experts expect to define 2026. The gap between satire and prediction becomes thinner with every frame they rewatch. So we are left with one troubling question. Are these coincidences, or have we been looking at a map of the future without realizing it? For anyone trying to understand why people keep talking about The Simpsons and predictions, the best place to start is with the long trail of coincidences the show has built over more than 3 decades. These moments were never announced as clues or warnings. They were jokes tucked inside a cartoon that aired during dinner time. Yet many of them ended up matching real events with uncomfortable accuracy. One of the earliest examples came from an episode released in the year 2000, showing a future in which a well-known public figure unexpectedly becomes president. At the time, it was nothing more than a playful scene meant to exaggerate American politics. Years later, when the election unfolded exactly as the episode had joked, major news outlets pointed out the eerie resemblance. It was the moment when many viewers first wondered if the show's writers had somehow glimpsed further ahead than everyone else. Technology provided even more strange parallels. Long before smartwatches became common, The Simpsons featured characters casually talking into wrist devices. The idea looked ridiculous then, but today millions of people use wearable screens every day. The same thing happened with video calls. In the 90s, it was still a novelty, something only imagined in science fiction. The show portrayed it as an everyday tool. And years later, it became a global standard. Another moment that drew attention involved automated machines. The Simpsons once depicted robots assisting workers in factories, something that felt exaggerated at the time. Since then, automation has become a defining part of manufacturing across the world. Again, the old scenes looked less like satire and more like previews of society's next major shift. When these coincidences are viewed individually, they seem amusing. When they are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. The show consistently highlighted social tensions, political risks, and technological trends before they reached the spotlight. It did not do this through prediction in the scientific sense. Instead, it amplified issues that people were ignoring, often years before the rest of the world caught up. The surprise comes from how often real events ended up mirroring the exaggerated versions. This long history is what makes the present moment feel different. If scenes from decades ago repeatedly align with reality, then what happens when current analysts notice that certain old episodes resemble the early signals of 2026? These are not small coincidences anymore. They touch on politics, technology, global safety, and cultural change. The same categories that produced past parallels. And that leads to a single unsettling thought. If the jokes of the past eventually came true, what will the jokes connected to 2026 reveal when the year finally unfolds. When people talk about strange coincidences from The Simpsons, the conversation usually turns to politics or technology. Yet some of the most unsettling parallels are the ones connected to food and the environment because they touch every part of daily life. These moments do not feel like playful exaggerations anymore. They feel like warnings that slipped into the background and waited years to be noticed. One of the clearest examples comes from an episode that aired in 1994. It showed a school cafeteria quietly mixing horse meat into regular lunches. At the time, it looked like an absurd joke that pushed the limits of cartoon humor. Nearly 2 decades later, BBC News reported that several European countries were investigating large amounts of horse meat sold as beef. The discovery spread across national borders and turned into a major scandal. Viewers who remembered the old episode were stunned because the joke suddenly looked far too familiar. Another environmental parallel appeared even earlier. In 1990, the show introduced Blinky, a 3-eyed fish found near a nuclear power plant. The image became iconic because it symbolized the fear of contaminated water and industrial waste, but it was still viewed as comedy. Then, in 2011, international news outlets reported that an Argentine fisherman had caught a real fish with 3 eyes in a lake near a nuclear facility. Photos of the creature circulated online, and many people immediately pointed to the old cartoon, placing the 2 images side by side. The comparison was impossible to ignore. These examples highlight a broader pattern. The Simpsons often used extreme visuals to criticize pollution, unsafe food systems, and long-term environmental neglect. Decades later, those same visuals now resemble headlines. Contaminated meat scandals, toxic waterways, mutated animals, and failing infrastructures are no longer distant fears. They appear in reports, scientific surveys, and regional investigations around the world. This is why analysts reviewing older episodes are starting to worry. Many environmental experts warn that 2026 may mark the start of a stronger cycle of climate pressure due to rising temperatures, unstable ecosystems, and disrupted food supply chains. When those warnings are placed next to the show's earlier depictions, the similarities feel oddly precise. Scenes of tainted products, poisoned rivers, and strange wildlife no longer look like cartoon exaggerations. They look like previews of what happens when years of strain finally break through the surface. The result is an uneasy sense that past jokes are colliding with present reality. If meat contamination and mutated fish once seen on television eventually showed up in the real world, then what happens if the next environmental storyline from The Simpsons aligns with the stresses expected in 2026? This chapter forces a simple question. Are we witnessing coincidences from an animated show, or are we watching early signals of environmental trouble finally catching up to us? If the environmental coincidences from The Simpsons feel eerie, the technological ones are even harder to ignore. Technology changes fast, yet the show had an unusual habit of sketching ideas long before they became part of everyday life. What once looked like impossible gadgets or exaggerated jokes now reads like a timeline that reality quietly followed. One of the most famous examples comes from a small moment that turned into a major story years later. In an episode from the 90s, a digital assistant changes the phrase, "beat up Martin" into "eat up Martha." It was meant to be a joke about clumsy software. Much later, an Apple engineer revealed in interviews that this exact line became an internal reminder during the development of the first iPhone. It symbolized how unreliable autocorrect used to be, and how seriously the team needed to improve the feature before the product could succeed. The idea that a cartoon punchline influenced real design culture shows how deeply The Simpsons had already seeped into the world of technology. Instead of focusing on futuristic gadgets, what stands out most today is how The Simpsons understood the impact technology would eventually have on people. The show never treated new devices as the main story. It treated the way humans depended on them as the real joke. Back then, it felt like an exaggeration. Now it feels familiar. The episodes imagined a world where technology slowly shaped behavior, changed routines, and pulled people deeper into screens than they expected. When these scenes first aired, they looked unrealistic. From 2023 to 2025, as virtual and augmented reality grew rapidly, many viewers began noticing how closely the show's humor matched real-life concerns. People worried about losing focus, spending too much time in digital worlds, and allowing software to quietly guide daily choices. But the most unsettling category involves digital addiction. Episodes from 2000 and 2016 showed characters slipping into virtual worlds, losing track of time, and escaping reality through screens that replaced face-to-face life. At the time, it looked like an exaggeration of internet culture. Yet from 2023 to 2025, the rapid growth of VR and AR raised serious concerns among parents, teachers, and lawmakers. Reports warned that extended immersion could reshape human interaction and increase dependence on simulated environments. Similar fears appeared in news discussions about attention loss, isolation, and behavioral changes linked to virtual platforms. This is the pattern analysts worry about. The Simpsons often amplifies existing ideas before society fully understands them. Years later, those exaggerated scenes line up with real technological shifts. The show did not predict innovation in a scientific sense. It simply recognized the early signs of change, magnified them, and unintentionally sketched a future that modern life ended up matching. Now that multiple older episodes seem to echo current technological anxieties, viewers are left with a difficult question. If the past jokes about autocorrect, video calls, smart devices, and digital addiction all became real, then what about the gags we have not reached yet? What technology that The Simpsons once portrayed as comedy will step into reality in 2026? Long before artificial intelligence became part of everyday conversations, The Simpsons had already imagined a world where robots slip out of human control. In a 1994 episode, the family visits a high-tech theme park filled with android performers. Everything seems playful until the machines malfunction, turn hostile, and begin chasing the guests. At the time, it felt like a light parody of science fiction. No one treated it as anything more than a joke. But in recent years, scenes like that suddenly feel less distant. In 2023, several international news outlets reported an incident in which a chess-playing robot grabbed and fractured a child's finger during a match. The event shocked viewers because it revealed how unpredictable automated systems can be when something goes wrong. It was not a theme park gone wild, but it carried the same message. A machine built to entertain can still behave in ways humans did not expect. Meanwhile, research groups around the world began sounding alarms about another layer of risk. Throughout 2024 and 2025, AI safety reports circulated widely, warning that advanced systems were developing so quickly that regulation and oversight were falling behind. Experts raised concerns about models making autonomous decisions, manipulating data, or generating results their creators could not fully explain. These were not fictional robots chasing park guests. These were real-world systems shaping business, communication, and national infrastructure faster than society could adapt. The speed of this evolution is what makes the old episodes unsettling. The Simpsons did not predict robotics or AI in a technical sense. It simply pushed the idea to an extreme for comedic effect. Yet now, with artificial intelligence doubling in capability every year, those exaggerated scenes look strangely familiar. Machines that once lived only in cartoons are becoming tools with enormous influence. They manage factories, assist doctors, write software, and analyze personal information at a scale no human team could match. This brings us to the twist that analysts find most disturbing. Multiple companies have announced that 2026 will mark the commercial release of a new generation of AI systems. One's designed to operate with far greater autonomy and real-time learning. These platforms are meant to manage everything from logistics to environmental monitoring. The timing draws attention because it aligns with the same year. The Simpsons once portrayed a world on the edge of a robot uprising. The show amplified the fear for humor. Reality now echoes the structure in a quieter, more subtle way. So viewers are left with a difficult question. If past jokes about malfunctioning machines and runaway systems later mirrored real events, what happens when society enters a year tied so closely to one of the show's most dramatic warnings? In 2026, will AI become humanity's greatest tool, or the moment when fiction steps a little too close to reality? When people revisit the strangest coincidences in The Simpsons, the conversation often returns to power and surveillance. These are not lighthearted themes. They sit at the center of global politics, and yet the show handled them with humor long before the real world revealed the scale behind them. Looking back now, the episodes feel less like satire and more like early shadows of events that would later dominate international headlines. One of the clearest examples comes from an episode released in 2014 that portrayed a chaotic and corrupt international soccer organization. The storyline exaggerated bribery and power struggles, turning the whole system into a punchline. Then, in 2015, the world watched as officials from a major global soccer federation were arrested in Zurich after investigations by the FBI and the IRS into corruption and financial misconduct. News outlets immediately pointed to the old cartoon, noting how closely the fictional scandal resembled the real one. What had been a joke suddenly looked like a preview. Another moment that resurfaced came from the Simpsons movie in 2007. In one sequence, characters joke about a massive surveillance agency secretly monitoring personal conversations. It seemed absurd at the time, an over-the-top poke at government power. Yet in 2013, the world learned through leaked documents that large-scale data collection programs were operating globally. News coverage from that year confirmed monitoring practices that shocked the public and changed the way people viewed digital privacy. The cartoon's exaggerated moment suddenly felt far too accurate. These parallels do not imply that the writers had secret knowledge of future scandals. Rather, they highlight a recurring pattern. The show often focused on the same pressure points that eventually exploded in the real world. Concentrated power, unchecked authority, and secrecy that grows until it breaks into public view. In each case, the comedy exposed a fragile system long before the news cameras arrived. When the real events surfaced, audiences noticed the similarity and wondered how a cartoon had managed to capture the tone so precisely. This recurring cycle is what makes current analysts uneasy. Power, surveillance, and political secrecy tend to move in waves. They rise, fade, and return, often triggered by moments of stress or transition. And 2026 is shaping up to be one of those years. Newspapers and research groups have already noted that it will be a major global election cycle. More than one region will choose new leadership, and political systems across the world will undergo tests that could reshape alliances, regulations, and public trust. When this context is placed next to the old episodes, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. If The Simpsons once mirrored corruption scandals and surveillance revelations, what happens when the world enters another period defined by political tension and shifting power? In a year as pivotal as 2026, which storyline will come alive next? Among the strangest parallels between The Simpsons and real-world events, the category that unsettles scientists the most is the one involving discoveries that should have been impossible for a cartoon to anticipate. These moments do not revolve around politics or technology. They reach into the territory of physics, culture, and global economics, realms that usually move far beyond the imagination of a comedy writer's room. Yet somehow the connections continue to appear. One example that repeatedly surprises physicists comes from a 1998 episode in which Homer briefly writes a math equation on a chalkboard. At first glance, it looks like nonsense, just another layer of background humor. But years later, journalists and science commentators noticed that the formula produced a value remarkably close to the predicted mass of the Higgs boson. When CERN confirmed the particle's existence in 2012, the comparison resurfaced across major news sites. Of course, the show did not calculate the universe's most elusive particle, but the coincidence was striking enough that even scientists admitted it was oddly close. Another moment that traveled from cartoon to reality involved a performance scene from a 2012 episode featuring a musician suspended in mid-air during a dramatic entrance. It was meant to exaggerate the spectacle of pop culture. 5 years later, viewers watched a real-life Super Bowl halftime show that used the same floating entrance, matching the animation almost beat for beat. The parallels spread across social media as people placed the two images side by side. It was yet another example of how the show's humor kept aligning with events that had not happened yet. Even global finance entered this strange category. In an early 2000s storyline, The Simpsons referenced Greece's economic collapse long before it became an international crisis. Years later, the country faced a severe financial breakdown that led to intense negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. News commentators noted how unexpectedly close the cartoon's reference had been to the timing and severity of the real event. These examples share the same pattern. The show often exaggerates scientific ideas, cultural extremes, or economic pressure points for comedic effect. But when the same themes later surface in headlines, viewers begin to wonder whether the writers unintentionally captured the mood of emerging events long before the world recognized them. Science fiction often foreshadows innovation, but The Simpsons used comedy to do something similar without ever claiming to predict anything. This is why analysts reviewing the episodes tied to 2026 feel a deeper sense of tension. If humor about particle physics, floating stage stunts, and financial collapse eventually aligned with reality, what happens when the show touches subjects that science is only beginning to explore? If past discoveries arrived years after their cartoon versions, then what phenomenon waiting in 2026 will mirror a joke viewers once ignored? And more importantly, will we recognize it before it happens? Some of the most unsettling parallels between The Simpsons and the real world come from episodes that were never meant to be taken seriously at all. These are the moments that turn disaster into comedy, long before similar events unfolded outside the screen. When viewed today, they feel less like jokes and more like warnings buried inside bright colors and fast punchlines. When viewed today, they feel less like jokes and more like warnings buried inside bright colors and fast punchlines. One of the clearest examples appeared in a 2006 episode involving a small tourist submersible that loses contact underwater. The sequence shows mounting fear, equipment failure, and a sudden catastrophic collapse. For years, the scene remained just another cartoon exaggeration. Then, in 2023, the world watched reports about the Titan submersible, which vanished during a dive and later suffered a catastrophic implosion. News outlets across the globe immediately compared the real event to the old episode, highlighting how closely the fictional scenario matched the tragedy. Another storyline that resurfaced came from a 1998 episode joking about stolen restaurant grease. At the time, the idea seemed too absurd to exist anywhere beyond animation. Yet between 2008 and 2015, multiple American news organizations reported a thriving underground market for stolen used cooking oil worth tens of millions of dollars. Some reports estimated losses across the industry at more than $70 million. Once again, a cartoon gag years earlier appeared strangely connected to a real trend. The show also touched on food sustainability long before it became a global concern. In a 1995 episode, the future was depicted as a world struggling to maintain stable diets and ecological balance. It was written to poke fun at environmental anxiety. But during 2024 and 2025, organizations such as the Food and Agriculture Organization issued reports warning of rising food insecurity caused by climate pressure, disrupted supply chains, and declining crop yields. The tone of those warnings echoed themes that The Simpsons had once treated as harmless humor. These connections create a disturbing pattern. Each time, a comedic scenario eventually lined up with a real problem that grew larger than anyone expected. The show was not predicting disasters. It was amplifying vulnerabilities that the world later exposed on its own. And this is what makes the present moment so unnerving. If a fictional submersible disaster mirrored a real one, and if jokes about stolen grease and unstable food systems later reflected true crises, then what happens next? Which disaster written as comedy might reappear in 2026, no longer as a joke but as the next headline? When you step back from every example and look at the entire picture, a clear pattern emerges. The Simpsons has never been a machine that predicts the future. It does not see events before they happen. What it does instead is reflect the cracks forming beneath the surface of society. It exaggerates early signals in politics, technology, economics, and the environment, and those signals often grow into real-world problems years later. The show held up a mirror long before the audience understood what they were looking at. This is why 2026 feels different. The world is moving toward a year marked by rapid acceleration and deep uncertainty. New generations of artificial intelligence are preparing to enter the commercial market with abilities far beyond previous systems. Environmental pressure is rising as heat, storms, and unstable ecosystems reshape food supplies. Reports continue warning about shortages and unpredictable harvests. Technology is weaving itself deeper into daily life, creating risks that were once dismissed as science fiction. Each of these trends resembles themes the show highlighted decades ago as jokes. Now those jokes look like warnings. They remind us that issues ignored for too long eventually surface in ways no one can control. They remind us that small cracks can become global problems. And they remind us that the world often follows patterns we fail to notice until they reach a breaking point. So the final question is simple and unsettling. Among the many scenes in The Simpsons that have not yet come true, which one will mirror reality in 2026? Leave your thoughts below and subscribe to mindgap, because the next mystery may already be hiding in plain sight.